Quick, you have 2 seconds to name these two countries.
I've already seen this video before a long time ago, and I also know what the football war is already, so it's obviously El Salvador and Honduras, but I would be very curious who actually got these countries right on the first try because that is extremely impressive.
You're wrong, unless you got it right. Then good job. They are, of course, Honduras and El Salvador. One thing these two countries have in common is being fanatic about football. Or if you're a freedom-loving patriot, soccer. But do they love it so much they would...
So, there's a kind of a common misconception that the United States is the only country that calls football soccer. In fact, Canada, Ireland, both Northern and regular Ireland, and South Africa, they all call football soccer. In fact, there's actually some Caribbean countries that call football voetbal with a V. So the game soccer is called a lot of different things across the world, which just shows how international it is. But we're not the only country that calls it soccer. Our neighbors to the north call it soccer, and other English-speaking countries also call it soccer.
war over it? You bet they would, and that is no bueno. If you look at these two countries, you might notice one major difference, and that is that this one is a lot bigger than this one. However, this one had a larger population than this one, made up mostly of farmers, and there wasn't enough land for them to live and work on. So they started moving from El Salvador to Honduras in search of land, and by the 1960s, a huge number of illegal immigrants had crossed over the border from El...
Do you see the historical trends already happening here? You see these historical trends happening across the world today where people looking for a better life, they will go undocumented and sometimes, in the case of Honduras, unwanted to different countries. So this is not unique to the United States. This is a phenomenon that's gone on for all of humankind and frankly will continue to go on.
Meanwhile, in Honduras, it's 1963, and this guy has just staged a military coup to prevent the rise of communism and is now the military leader of the country. He immediately began harassing the peasants' unions and other left-wing groups, but he's a little insecure about the legitimacy of his leadership. So he holds an election, and...
This is the time where the United States was frankly toppling governments in multiple regions of the country to establish what were essentially pro-Western dictatorships. I believe Oversimplified is going to mention it later, but the United States had a huge stake in tropical fruits within this country, more specifically bananas. But the goal was to establish pro-Western dictatorships, and this is not unique to El Salvador. Honduras. This is happening across the world, famously in Korea and Vietnam, which obviously had a major effects on the Korean and Vietnam Wars. A lesser known case is actually Liberia. So Liberia, the U.S. toppled a pro-Soviet dictator and essentially established what was a pro-Western dictator, but it also led to 2 Liberian civil wars. Nicaragua is another country where this happened. So if you're very interested in this, there's tons of lists online where it has where the United States would topple governments all in the name of stopping communism.
But then the opposing party says, hey man, that election was clearly corrupt and fraudulent, and also you've been bribed by the rich American banana companies who are taking all of our bananas tax-free, and now our economy is in ruins, and everyone started to get mad at him. Now if you ever find...
So this is a huge thing. When you're a dictator, you need to build your legitimacy, and the best way to do that is to build it through democratic systems. So a way to do this is to alter the constitution of your country or pack the courts. Well, in this leader's case, he had an election and he rigged that election, trying to make it seem democratic, to try to seem that he was democratically voted in by his people. However, as you can see, it did not work. So he would need to find a group to blame, and I'll talk about that later.
Yourself the barely legitimate military leader of a corrupt Central American country, and you start getting into hot water, here's a bit of advice that has been tried and tested throughout the centuries. Blame something else. So he blamed the Salvadoran immigrants for stealing all the land and all the jobs and ruining Honduras. The immigrants found themselves under attack by the hostile locals. Egged on by...
Tried and tested indeed. This is the most tried and tested method of mankind. When you're a illegitimate leader and your regime is at risk, you need to find a group to blame. Idi Amin, this is an excellent example. He is also known as the Butcher of Uganda, probably one of the worst leaders in human history. But to try to re-legitimize his regime, to try to get the people of Uganda back to supporting him, He forced all of the Asians out of the country and later all Western influence. Any Europeans, any Jews, any Asians, they were out of Uganda, all in the name of trying to blame someone else. But what often happens is your people realize that those people weren't to blame. This is happening. This has happened all throughout history. So it's just very fascinating that these historical trends are happening within this region when same time, same different place, they're also happening. Sorry, I paused a lot.
Rich American banana companies who wanted all the bananas to themselves, the Honduran government began evicting Salvadoran immigrants who had been living on the land for generations and started sending them back to El Salvador. The Salvadoran elite were furious and protested, citing moral reasons, but in reality, they were just getting a little too crowded. So tensions were about as high as they could be, but then it's the 1970 World Cup qualifiers, and both countries finished top of their qualifying tables, so it was now time for them to play against each other in a series of matches. The first match took...
This is an interesting part of the 1970 World Cup qualifiers is actually simultaneously the United States was playing against Haiti. And as many of you know, there was a huge gap, a huge drought where the United States didn't make the World Cup from 1950 to what I want to say is 1992. U.S. didn't qualify, and it was actually a huge national embarrassment. They lost to Haiti 4-0. That would be just a travesty today. But Haiti ended up playing the winner of this series. But it's very fascinating that we had our own little soccer events going on, but it didn't lead to a war.
In Honduras. The night before the game, Hondurans gathered outside the Salvadoran team's hotel, making noise and taunting them. The next day, Honduras defeated the exhausted Salvadorans with a late 90th minute goal. After the match, a young Salvadoran fan, unable to bear her country's defeat, shot herself. Disturbingly, the Salvadoran government glorified the incident and made her into a national hero. And at the next game, fans brought pictures of her to the stadium. Emotions were running high as the next match took...
Martyrs have been a huge thing throughout history. John Brown for slavery, John Paul for the French Revolution. Many historical events can trace their roots back to martyrs, and it's extremely tragic that that she took her life for this. But it is also extremely tragic that they capitalized on the event. But martyrs are a little talked about aspect of history that I frankly think deserve a lot more attention.
In El Salvador, and this time the tables were turned. The Hondurans had to endure a sleepless night in their hotel, and the next day, before the match started, instead of the Honduran flag, the Salvadorans raised a dirty rag. So great job at reducing tensions. El Salvador...
Okay, that's pretty funny. This is not the only flag incident I can think of. Famously, after Yugoslavia won a huge international basketball tournament, I think it was the European Championships, Vlade Divac threw the flag of a pro-Croatian, I believe it was a pro-Croatian supporter, when he ran on the court waving the Croatian flag. Obviously, this was during the 1990s Yugoslavian Civil War, very close to it. So that created a huge national controversy over it. But waving a dirty rag, that has got to be one of the most disrespectful things a country can do prior to a soccer game. I'm surprised FIFA did not say or do anything about that.
Decisively over the exhausted Hondurans. While spectators battled in the stands, Team Honduras fled home in a bulletproof bus with rocks being thrown at them, and the Honduran coach reportedly told his players that they were lucky they lost. In response to the defeat, Hondurans began...
Imagine that. Imagine your coach telling you, good job, guys, when you were on the cusp of making the World Cup. That is insane. But many of these Latin American countries, they take soccer extremely seriously. The 30 for 30 did a documentary on the Colombian national team called the Two Escobars, and tragically, one of the players whose last name was Escobar was killed by the Colombian mob because he had an own goal in the 1992 World Cup against the United States, which ensured that Colombia could not qualify for the World, could not win the World Cup. It eliminated them from the World Cup. So these Latin American countries, they take soccer extremely seriously. So some of this should not come as a surprise.
terrorizing the Salvadoran settlers even more, in some cases reportedly throwing them off their land and burning down their homes, and the immigrants began fleeing back to El Salvador. The final game in Mexico would decide who went to the World Cup. It was close, but El Salvador came out victorious, knocking Honduras out of the tournament. The atmosphere is riotous, literally, and back in Honduras, attacks on the Salvadoran immigrants further increased. This was too much for El Salvador to bear. With its people under attack and an unmanageable refugee crisis on its hands, El Salvador severed all diplomatic ties with Honduras and declared war. The football war is also known as the 100 Hours War, because that's how long it lasted, making it one of the shortest wars in history. El Salvador started by carrying out air raids on strategic locations within Honduras, including Toncontin International Airport, which prevented the Honduran Air Force from getting into the sky. Then, with the...
This might sound terrible. I had no idea that either of these countries had an air force. I honestly thought that was, especially at this time, was reserved for I guess, wealthier countries, but I digress.
Carrier army, they began an invasion along two major roads, complete with light tanks and infantry. Their advance was rapid, and they were quickly approaching the Honduran capital. Then the Organization of American States met in a bit of a panic and unanimously agreed that war between El Salvador and Honduras was a bad thing and probably shouldn't continue. So they went to El Salvador and said, "Can you please stop invading?" And El Salvador declared, "Not until they stop being jerks," and so the war went on. The Honduran Air Force finally got into the sky, and with aid from neighboring Nicaragua, they successfully carried out air raids on Salvadoran air bases and oil facilities, crippling...
Nicaragua, another U.S.-backed dictatorship. I wonder why Honduras, the U.S.-backed dictatorship, is getting aid from Nicaragua, another U.S.-backed dictatorship. Doesn't take Einstein to figure that one out.
Salvadoran supply line and stopping their advance dead. Caught in a bit of a stalemate, the situation was no longer advantageous to El Salvador, so when the Organization of American States once again asked them to stop and agreed to ensure the safety of the Salvadoran immigrants, El Salvador relented, and a ceasefire was organized on the 18th of July. Then the OAS said, "Can you now please withdraw your troops from Honduras? No, please, no, please, no, please, no. Do it or we'll sanction you." You know what? Just for you, I'll do it. So El Salvador pulled its troops out of Honduras.
Sanctions have been a key policy to preventing wars. You see sanctions today in Russia. I believe the Russian ruble went down like 25% of its value when essentially all the major countries in the world imposed sanctions on it. This is it's a key policy tool to prevent war. It's obviously not preventing war in Ukraine, but it is useful, especially for a country like El Salvador. This could cripple their economy completely.
On the 2nd of August, and with casualties in the thousands, the war was over. The economies of both nations were damaged by the war, and El Salvador didn't have the capability to take care of all the returning immigrants, a crisis that eventually helped cause a civil war. The war left behind land and border disputes, some of which are still a cause of tension to this day. El Salvador went on to play in the World Cup, but lost every match they played and didn't make it past the group stage. So in the
end... These scores are pretty standard for countries like El Salvador when they qualify for the World Cup. The last World Cup, Panama, they got obliterated in every single game they played. North Korea in 2010 hilariously lost every game. In fact, they were initially not going to show the World Cup in North Korea because of fear of national embarrassment. And in their opening game against Brazil, they were actually extremely competitive. So they ended up playing the two other games, and I think North Korea lost by like 4 or 5 goals in each of their last 2 games. It was just a national embarrassment, and the coach immediately got fired. And the 2010 North Korean coach, I read in an article that the rumor is that he was sentenced to hard labor because North Korea was such an embarrassment at the World Cup. This is insane, but ever since that 2010 World Cup, North Korea has never qualified for the World Cup. They actually haven't even gotten to the Intercontinental Playoffs. So, big mistake on North Korea's part for firing their coach and sending him to hard labor, if the rumor of that was true.
They achieved anything, and there were no winners. Except for this guy.
No winners at all. Thank you, Bananas.